introducing our speaker today, Andrew Preston. As Corey indicated, Andrew is Senior Lecturer in American History at Cambridge University and a Fellow at Clare College. He is a specialist in the history of American foreign relations, broadly defined, and his research examines the applications of American power abroad and the intersections between the national and international, especially the influence of domestic politics and culture and what they have had on the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. He received his doctorate at Cambridge University in 2001, and he's also taught at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, the University of Victoria, and Yale University. Dr. Preston is a prolific scholar, and his research has had a significant influence on our field. The New Republic recently called him the rare scholar who can educate a non-academic audience in the complexity of an important subject. And he's done so in a number of publications. His first book was The War Council, McGeorge Bundy, the NSC, and Vietnam, which reviewers referred to as outstanding, impeccably researched, and a superb study of one of the key shapers of America's Vietnam policy. He's also the co-editor of Nixon in the World, U.S. Foreign Relations, 1969 to 1977, and has published over 20 articles and book chapters, including a chapter in a forthcoming anthology, which I will be editing. Beyond his scholarship, Dr. Preston serves on the editorial board of Diplomatic History. He was named a top young historian by the History News Network in 2010, and he just completed a 3-year term of service on the Executive Council of the Society for Historians of International Foreign Relations. They keep trying to change it to international relations, and I think that is filtered into my mind. Dr. Preston's lecture today will be based on his book, Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, Religion in American War and Diplomacy. The book, which Corey noted is the book of the semester here at BYU, has already been a finalist for the 2012 Kundell Prize in History, and reviewers have called it marvelously readable, extraordinarily important, and a staggering achievement that represents a landmark in the field of American foreign policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Preston.
Thanks so much for that. This is my first time in Utah. It's my first time to Provo, obviously, and I'm delighted to be here. It's a fantastic place, a beautiful place. I had some time yesterday to walk around and to drive around and to try and get to know a little bit, get to know the city a little bit. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here, so thanks very much for that, and thanks to all of you for coming. I've never been introduced with a prayer before, and I thank you for that. It was quite moving, I thought, and I hope you don't need divine inspiration to learn something from my lecture. I'll try and make it easier than that, but it's good to know that I do have some help in getting my points across. And I'd also like to thank my good friend Andy Johns for that introduction that was way too generous, but for which I'm also grateful. I'd like to begin my talk by explaining the purposes of the book that I've just written. Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith examines the religious influence on American foreign relations from the late 16th century to the very recent past. The main purpose of the book is to trace the historical evolution of the relationship between American religion and American foreign relations. And it's a relationship that I see as very deep, as very profound, and as very enduring. And yet it was a relationship that until quite recently was all but mostly ignored by historians of American foreign relations, by political scientists, and by other scholars. And when American diplomatic historians did look at the religious influence on American foreign relations, they would tend to cluster around a few famous examples, people who I call the usual suspects, figures like Woodrow Wilson or John Foster Dulles, occasionally Ronald Reagan, and of course the infamous China missionaries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So aside from those clusters, if you read the literature, the secondary literature on American diplomatic history, you really wouldn't find much of a religious influence at all. Then came 9/11, and things changed dramatically. 9/11, especially the dueling religious rhetoric of George W. Bush and Osama bin Laden, and others who we normally don't think of as particularly religious, or who we didn't think of as particularly religious, people like Saddam Hussein and Tony Blair in Britain, generated an immense amount of interest in the role of religion in U.S. foreign policy. People everywhere in the world seemed to be explaining their worldview or explaining their position in the world by way of religion. And 9/11, this wasn't new. People all of a sudden after 9/11 didn't start using religion to explain their position. But what 9/11 did was highlight something that had already been going on and reveal it to scholars. And this is how I begin the book. I begin the book with a preface where I was teaching at Yale, and my students wanted to know where this came from, and especially in the American context, whether George W. Bush's rhetoric had historical precedence. A lot of the attention that scholars paid to religion and international relations, or religion and U.S. foreign policy, however, was either episodic, so it would focus quite deeply on one particular episode or one particular figure, or it was concerned with current affairs. Quite understandably, people wanted to get to grips with the presence of religion in world politics and religion in American foreign policy in the post-9/11 era. So those two things, the episodic nature of the literature, but also the highly political and often polemical nature of the literature, was understandable, but it did mean that there was still a large gap to fill. By the same token, and I found this surprising as well as I began the book, religious historians, that is, historians of American religion, hadn't really paid much attention to the links between religion and foreign relations either. They were very much interested in how American religion reacted under the pressures of World War I or World War II, but they seemed to be, with some exceptions, they seemed to be less interested in how American religion helped shape American policy in World War I or World War II or any other episode in American foreign relations. And so what I discovered was that there were two enormous bodies of scholarship, enormous bodies of secondary literature in American religion, the history of American religion, and the history of American foreign relations that had more or less grown up alongside each other without speaking to each other. And only in a few instances did these historiographies meet and engage in conversation with one another in productive ways. But for the most part, they had grown up in isolation. And those are two enormous subjects, American religion and American foreign relations. They're two of the biggest in American history, and yet they didn't really have much of a productive dialogue with each other. There were, of course, and are, of course, exceptions to this. There have been historians who have traced the links between religion and foreign relations, and I acknowledge them in my book, but those scholars were very much the exception to the rule. This is where my book comes in, and it's why I've attempted to trace the roots of this relationship between religion and foreign relations back to the colonial era and carry it through up to the present. There was no synthetic work. There was no one book that people could turn to examine this relationship between religion and foreign policy. I argue in the book that the religious influence on American foreign relations was consistent, and that sounds like a fairly basic premise, but it really surprised me. When I began researching the book, I thought that the religious influence would be episodic, reflecting the nature of the literature. Religion's influence on foreign relations ebbed and flowed, to be sure, and it wasn't always determining. That's something we have to keep in mind, but it was always there. There wasn't a single, well, there was one era that I'll get to later on in the talk where religion didn't have much of an influence on on American foreign relations. But for the most part, it has been an enduring and consistent influence. And I also argue that of these ideas, ideas about religious liberty were particularly important and particularly enduring. And I draw more or less a straight line from the early chapters in the colonial era up to the present under the theme of religious liberty. A lot of the chapters touch on that theme of the promotion of religious liberty. The first 5 chapters of the book deal with the period up to 1791, from English Protestant ideas about religion, security, and empire in the late 16th century to the First Amendment separation of church and state. And of course, there are entire libraries devoted to the establishment and free exercise clauses. What I've tried to do with topics like that have always been seen as domestic topics is then try and link them to the practice of American foreign policy or American foreign relations for lack of a better term. Chronologically, at the other end of the spectrum, the last chapter of the book deals with Ronald Reagan and the end of the Cold War. And I do have an epilogue. I finish with a fairly brief epilogue that deals with George W. Bush and Barack Obama and places them both in very different ways, squarely within the history that I've traced in the previous 28 chapters or so. And yes, I do argue that Obama is very much a part, fits very squarely in the history of the religious influence on American foreign relations in a very different way from George W. Bush. That epilogue, by the way, is fairly brief. It's something that I hadn't really planned to include in the book because it was still too present. The Bush presidency was very close in time. It was something that I felt, if I included, would date the book fairly quickly. It took me a lot longer to write this book than I'd planned, so I had hoped it would come out during the Bush presidency. It came out during the Obama presidency. It came out in 2012. And I did have an epilogue at my editor's insistence, as you can imagine. He wanted something on George W. Bush, and then he wanted something on Barack Obama. But I've tried to be as non-judgmental about those two presidents as possible because they still generate a lot of emotion and a lot of heat. And yet I do see them very much as part of the religious tradition in American foreign relations. By using such a large sweep, I wanted to give a fuller account of the many diverse and often contradictory ways in which religion helped give shape to America's role in the world. In fact, the central premise of my book is that while religion provided many Americans, not all Americans, but many Americans, with a cultural and ideological lens through which to view the world, a mental map, if you will, there was no one single religious influence, but many. And that through an endless series of arguments about America's role in the world, these clashing influences often produced a synthesis that pushed U.S. foreign policy in a highly moralistic and normative direction. And one of my research questions when I began the book was, why is U.S. foreign policy more idealistic, more moralistic? Why does it rely on norms and values more than the foreign policies of other countries? At least, why has it in 19th and 20th century history? And the answer I come up with in the book is that a great deal of this, or a great part of this answer, has to do with the unusual prevalence of religion in American foreign policy. For these reasons, the book is entitled Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, which comes from the cobbling together of two phrases in Paul's epistle to the Ephesians on how to be a proper Christian. And Paul doesn't use those two phrases together. I've manipulated them and I've taken them, not out of context, I don't think, but I've taken them from different verses and put them together. I use these phrases and I've put them together not only because several American foreign policymakers themselves invoked these phrases to explain their own worldviews, including Woodrow Wilson and John Foster Dulles, two of those usual suspects, but because they convey the book's core argument that the religious influence has made American foreign relations unusually moralistic, normative, and values-driven, both in terms of war, the sword of the Spirit, and peace, the shield of faith, in terms of conservatism and liberalism, nationalism and internationalism, militarism and pacifism, exceptionalism and cosmopolitanism. So the religious influence wasn't unidirectional. It wasn't consensual, it wasn't static, and it wasn't monolithic. And I think that of the few examples of historians who did examine the religious influence on American foreign policy before 9/11, mostly they have, and I want to be careful here because I owe a lot to these pioneers in the field, but generally they did see the religious influence as monolithic. They did see it as one type of religion, as pushing in one direction. Just by way of example, when I began the book, a fellow historian asked me, he said, so your book is basically going to be Bush backwards, meaning you're going to be tracing the ways in which religion has been used to justify war and imperialism and so on and so forth. And when I began the book, I thought it would be that kind of book, not polemical as that statement implies, but certainly one in which religion was used to justify or to explain American exceptionalism or American intervention in the world. And the story that I actually found once I got into the primary sources was very different. I have two main approaches in explaining how and why religion has influenced the conduct of American foreign relations. The first should be familiar to anyone studying foreign policy or diplomatic history or political history. and that's to take a top-down approach, to examine the elites who make foreign policy and who made foreign policy in the past. And this is somewhat out of fashion among historians because it usually involves the study of those dreaded figures, dead white men. But it's unavoidable if you're going to be studying high politics or foreign policy. You can't avoid policymakers, and until quite recently, most American foreign policymakers, if not all American foreign policymakers, until the last few decades, have been these elites. And so that's one approach I took, was to identify the religious worldviews of individual foreign policymakers. The other approach that I took is newer to the field, at least newer to our field of American diplomatic history, and also to international history more broadly, and that's to take a more bottom-up approach, what we might call the social history of international affairs or world politics. This is to look at the influence that non-policymaking, non-elites held, and how these ordinary people, ordinary Americans belonging to certain religious communities, how they influence the conduct of American foreign policy. Common to both of these groups, the top-down and the bottom-up, the elites and who we might call ordinary Americans, although I've got into trouble for using that phrase because it seems to flatten out Americans and make non-policy-making Americans seem all the same, but I'm going to stick to it, I think, because I think it conveys exactly what I'm trying to get at. Common to both of these groups of top-down elites and ordinary Americans is that religion shaped their perceptions of the wider world and of America's role in it. That's not to say it shaped every American's role, but certainly of the religious Americans who I examine in the book, it certainly did. And the narrative and analytical engine of the book is powered by the negotiations, the discussions, the debates, the arguments, and the interactions between these two groups, usually with the bottom-up pressuring the elites, including non-religious elites, to act in a certain way in American foreign policy. And what I'd like to do in the time that I have left is to give you one case study, one example that's based on a couple of chapters to show you what I mean, although I'd be happy in the Q&A that follows to discuss some other examples. Well, we have to be careful about speaking with any certainty of individual religious belief and then linking it to behavior such as politics and foreign policy. It's difficult, if not impossible, to speak with any certainty about what people believe because there's ultimately no way of knowing. There's no way of me proving what any of you in this audience actually believe. Even if you tell me this is what I believe and this is how it influences my view towards politics and foreign policy, because there's no way that I can get inside your head. There's no way that I can access that interior world with any certainty to be able to prove that your religion influences the way you behave in this world. And for this reason, religious sociologists and anthropologists and other scholars in religious studies departments are very careful about speaking of belief, that so-and-so believes a certain practice or a certain religious belief. And if it's impossible for me to prove beyond doubt what any of you believe, what any of you in this audience believe, and how that influences your daily life, imagine just how difficult it is if you're trying to do that with someone who lived 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 or 300 years ago. As historians, I argue the best we can do is examine the manifestations of belief, both private and public, and look for consistencies and regularities, or to look for inconsistencies and irregularities between what we know of someone's private faith and what we can determine about their public actions. And here I'm borrowing a concept from Jose Casanova, who's a religious sociologist at Georgetown and one of the foremost scholars of religion and globalization. And Casanova uses the term discursive reality, which I think hits the nail right on the head, at least the nail that I'm trying to drive home. Casanova examines the surge in religious belief worldwide in the modern era. He basically argues that globalization, rather than ushering in a more secular world, has ushered in a more religious world. And I think he's right. And he's taken some criticism from other sociologists by saying, well, you're saying that religious belief around the world has increased, but how can you prove that these people actually believe what they're saying they believe? And he says, well, that's not really the point. I'm not really trying to prove that they actually believe these things. What I'm talking about is a discursive reality. What I'm more interested in is that people are saying they believe in certain religions more than they ever have before. and that we can, as far as we can determine based on the available evidence, we can see how their professed belief influences their daily behavior. And that's exactly the approach that I've tried to adopt in my book. In other words, did policymakers take religious ideas, observances, and other manifestations of faith seriously? Was their public use of religion consistent with their private faith? Did they make religion a central part of their life? And as far as we can determine, was it a part of their policymaking? And the answers that I come up with in the book, I think are, some of them are quite surprising. For example, I argue that the foreign policies of some of the most personally devout presidents, such as Jimmy Carter, were not as religiously motivated as we might assume. And when I planned the book, I planned to have at least one chapter on Jimmy Carter, and I really couldn't find very much religion in Jimmy Carter's foreign policy, despite the fact that nobody doubts the sincerity of his faith or the depth of his faith. And now I think I have 5 or 6 pages on Jimmy Carter as opposed to at least a chapter. Then there are those like William McKinley, Woodrow Wilson, John Foster Dulles, or Ronald Reagan, who were clearly religious and whose religion clearly influenced their worldview, but in ways that historians have not fully appreciated. And I think we've completely misunderstood McKinley and Dulles in particular. Other figures such as Richard Nixon professed a great religiosity. Nixon was the first to sign off every speech habitually with God Bless America. So he professed a great religiosity in public while almost entirely ignoring it in private, at least in the making of his foreign policy. And here's where the inconsistencies I found were quite helpful. While others who are not normally thought of as particularly religious, such as Abraham Lincoln or George Kennan, did regularly turn to religion to explain their worldview and to formulate their foreign policy. So in this sense, my book is an exercise in historical recovery. Revisionism, yes, but I think a more appropriate word is recovery, for, as I argue in the book, we've completely misinterpreted the religious backgrounds of several key foreign policymakers. And I think this is because historians haven't been very good at taking religion at face value and taking the religion of policymakers at face value. That's not to say that historians should accept prima facie, automatically everything that someone says about their religion, or about any other subject for that matter. But historians haven't really taken a policymaker's religious words at face value in the sense that they haven't accepted that this policymaker could be sincere, that these religious expressions, these religious words, could actually reflect what this policymaker is getting at in formulating his foreign policy, or that it could help explain how this policymaker views the world and wants the United States to act in it. And then by not taking religion at face value, by not taking it seriously, and frankly by condescending to it, historians then have done a fairly poor job at understanding that religion and then understanding how those religious values can be applied in the world. And to illustrate what I mean, I'd like to consider one example in particular, and that is of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As I'm sure a lot of you know, FDR isn't normally considered by historians to have been a religious person, let alone a religious president. And when I began the book, a friend of mine who specializes in FDR and has written widely on FDR and FDR's politics and his foreign policy said, well, you're writing this synthesis, this grand sweep of American foreign relations history. What on earth are you going to do when you get to the Roosevelt presidency and World War II? Because any survey or synthesis of American foreign policy can't ignore World War II. It's probably the most important episode in American foreign relations history, and certainly one of the most important in world history over the last 3 or 4 or 5 centuries. And at the time, I had no answer for him. Because I had the view that most historians have of Franklin Roosevelt, and that's that he wasn't particularly religious. And so I thought, well, this is a case where I'm going to have to fit a secular president within a religious context, perhaps. Or I didn't really have any very good answers for him. I didn't have any good answers for his contention that FDR wasn't religious and wasn't a religious president. And yet, once I started to get into the primary source material, into the original evidence and documents, I discovered that nothing could be further from the truth. That in fact, Franklin Roosevelt was an incredibly religious person, and that he actively sought to apply his religious values to his public policy, including his foreign policy. Franklin Roosevelt himself was asked early in his presidency in 1933 how he would define his philosophy, and this is what he said. He said, "I'm a Christian and a Democrat." That's all. That's all he said. And the historians who have used that phrase haven't really taken it at face value. They said, well, he was just saying that to a reporter. He was just saying that to be popular. And yet when we examine who FDR was, we find religion to be very much at the center. And here I was instructed by the use of memoirs. And if anyone's doing a dissertation or doing this kind of historical research, and part of it relies on biography or intellectual biography, memoirs of the contemporaries of the contemporaries who served with the person you are studying are incredibly helpful. And so in this case, I went to the memoirs of a lot of the people who served with FDR and who served with him the longest. People like Francis Perkins, people like Jim Farley, people like Robert Sherwood, who wrote that wonderful book of who was a speechwriter for FDR and wrote this wonderful book about the relationship between Harry Hopkins and Franklin Roosevelt. And I also used the memoirs of Eleanor Roosevelt, who by her own admission and by everyone else's admission, certainly wasn't religious. She was, I don't think she ever used the word atheist, but she was certainly an agnostic and a skeptic, and probably today would define herself as something of an atheist. And all of them, to a person, use phrases in their memoirs when they're recalling Franklin Roosevelt, about phrases like, religion was the most powerful force within him, or religion really was the prism through which Franklin viewed the world. And even Eleanor Roosevelt says that too. And in her memoirs, and she wrote, I think, 3 memoirs of her time with Franklin Roosevelt, she says, I couldn't get to grips with Franklin's religion. I didn't understand it. I didn't get it. I didn't understand why it meant so much to him, and yet it did. And to me, that said a lot. That said a lot. And then once I got into the documentary record, into the public the public papers, and also the private papers, the previously classified papers of his administration, I saw his religious fingerprints all over American foreign policy. This isn't surprising given Franklin Roosevelt's background, his biography. He was brought up in the Episcopal Church as a regular churchgoer by very devout parents, and he had a lifelong devotion to the Episcopal Church. And there are countless stories of frustrated aides at the height of the Second World War, wanting to discuss strategy or politics. Churchill's on the line, that sort of thing. And literally, FDR is sitting there in the Oval Office choosing new drapes for the church up in Hyde Park, for the Episcopal Church up in Hyde Park, or he's been on the phone with officials in the Episcopal Cathedral in New York, or perhaps up at the church at Hyde Park, about who the next vestryman would be, and that sort of thing. Within this Episcopalian upbringing, FDR was very attracted to the social gospel tradition, the noblesse oblige tradition within the Episcopal Church. Episcopalians were at the forefront of the social gospel. We often think of Methodists and perhaps Presbyterians, maybe Baptists, as being the most progressive or the most activist religious progressives in the early 20th century. But Episcopalians probably were the most fervent and the most activist members of the social gospel. Roosevelt was also attracted to the Episcopal Church's non-sectarian, ecumenical, and even anti-theological view of religion. And that's not to say Episcopalians are anti-theological, but they certainly wear their theology lightly, and that fitted FDR's temperament absolutely perfectly. And FDR was extremely ecumenical, multi-faith, interfaith, whichever term you'd like to use, in his approach to religion. He appointed more Jews and Catholics to his administration than all presidents before him combined, which is an astonishing statistic. And he was the president who really inaugurated what we now call the Judeo-Christian tradition, which didn't, I argue in the book, didn't really exist as a tradition, as a concept in the United States or anywhere else before the 1930s and before Franklin Roosevelt. The public record is also pretty clear. We don't just need to delve into FDR's private life to see that he was religious and applied religion to his foreign policy. The public record is also pretty clear. And we see these ideas in his use of religion in responding to the world crisis and also to American isolationism in the years between 1937 and 1941. FDR's main challenge was how to convince Americans that they had to take a more active role in resisting Nazism. So he had two obstacles in his way: Nazism in Europe and American isolationism at home. And in order to overcome both of these obstacles, he turned to religion. And he turned to religion in explaining what America should do. And he didn't just use religious rhetoric to religious audiences. He used it to more secular audiences as well. Take, for example, his 1939 State of the Union address, in which he more explicitly than ever before urged Americans to take a much more active role in the world crisis. He wasn't yet saying we should go to war, but he was urging Americans to take a much more oppositional role to the rise of Nazism. FDR begins the 1939 State of the Union address by saying that the Nazis were a threat to three great institutions in the world. The first was religion, the second, democracy, and the third, international goodwill. And he ranked them in that order because he said, without religion, you can't have democracy, and without democracy, you can't have international goodwill or peace. Nowadays, we'd call that democratic peace theory, and I'm sure a lot of you look at it, the idea that democracies don't go to war with one another, that the more democracies you have in the world, the more peaceful a world you'll have. But what Franklin Roosevelt did, and as far as I can tell, this is a fairly uniquely American tradition, was that he based it all on religion. And he said this time and time again in other places, that he based it all on religion. If you go back in European history to democratic peace theory, to Montesquieu and his argument that republics don't go to war with one another, to Kant, the same idea, religion is absent. But in Franklin Roosevelt's formulation, something that went back to Washington and Madison, he puts religion at the heart of the democratic peace. 2 years later, in his 1941 State of the Union, of course, he outlined the four freedoms, the second of which is the freedom of worship. So in a major speech in which he's announcing these are the four freedoms for which which Americans will defend around the world. Not yet at war, of course, because this is January 1941, but of these four basic freedoms, elemental freedoms that every society needs, one of them, of course, was religion. And in countless speeches, I'd love to quote them to you because they're fascinating speeches and they're great rhetoric. In countless, but I don't have time to quote them to you. In countless other speeches in this 1937 to 41 period, he framed the world crisis as a clash between religion and irreligion, or religion and godlessness, or atheism, or pick your term. I can't resist, so I will quote one example because it's one of my favorites. And that's his October 1941 Navy Day address, 2 months before the United States was officially at war after Pearl Harbor. And it was probably his most explicitly bellicose anti-German speech yet. In this Navy Day address, FDR alleged that Hitler had quote, a secret plan to abolish all existing religions, Catholic, Protestant, Mohammedan, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jewish alike, and replace them with an international Nazi church. Mein Kampf would replace the Bible and be enforced as Holy Writ, while the swastika will replace the cross. FDR even contemplated in 1941-42 an alliance of world religious leaders to combat the forces of irreligion. And he told one of his aides, Adolf Burley, to liaise with what he called the top Muslims and the top Buddhists and the top Jews and others around the world to start meeting with the representatives from Buddhist countries or Hindu countries or Muslim countries in Washington, and let's try and get a common front of faith to fight the forces of atheistic and paganistic Nazism. This plan to host a summit of world religious leaders in Washington, D.C. to combat the Nazis came to nothing, partly because Burley, who believed in it, Adolf Burley certainly believed in this project. He himself was religious, but he found it actually tough going because he discovered that not many other people in the world, even people from fairly religious countries, were all that interested in having a world religious summit. And there's one story in particular that I found amusing, and I related in the book, is that when he met with the Turkish, because neither FDR nor Burley knew who the top Muslim was, because they knew for the Catholic Church that you would go to the Vatican. They didn't know who to approach for world Islam. And so Burley contacted the Turkish ambassador, and they met, and Burley proposed this idea of a summit of world religious leaders to the Turkish ambassador, and then the Turkish ambassador you can read it, you can just sort of see him fidgeting and becoming more and more awkward in the meeting minutes, because he said, Mr. Burley, there's only one slight problem. You see, in our country, according to the Turkish constitution, there's a very strict separation of church and state. Or he didn't say church and state, but he said there's a very strict separation of religion and politics, and of religion and the state. And Burley then kind of thought, actually, so do we, now that you mention it, and perhaps this might be something of a problem. But it never occurred to Franklin Roosevelt that the First Amendment, in that sense, would be a problem. It took the Turks to point that out to him. Moreover, Roosevelt's framing of the war as one between peoples of faith and a totalitarian system opposed to faith had an ironic afterlife when Harry Truman used it to call for a crusade against Soviet communism in the early Cold War. Truman used the exact same rhetoric that FDR had used to apply to the Nazis, except he applied it to the Soviets. And in a lot of Truman's speeches, you could simply switch the word, you could imagine the word Nazi or Hitler, and instead you'd have Soviet or communist and Stalin. And as Will Inboden, in his wonderful book on religion in the early Cold War, relates in an entire chapter, Truman tried to revive Franklin Roosevelt's idea of a summit of world religious leaders in 1948. And this time he found a lot of willingness among Muslims and Buddhists, and especially the Vatican. And yet what killed the plan was the opposition of Protestants at home to having the Vatican on board. They said, well, we'd be happy to do this as long as the Vatican isn't involved. But the point I'm trying to make here is that FDR's ideas of promoting religious liberty in the service of American foreign policy had an ironic afterlife in helping to trigger the Cold War. Let me sum up with just a few general remarks, and then we can open it up to questions. Religion doesn't explain everything in the history of American foreign relations. It may not even explain most things. Many episodes in American diplomatic history, even very broadly defined, had little to do with religion. But it was a factor, I would argue, much more often than we've realized or acknowledged. It's a much more integral part of the history of American foreign relations. Religion never trumped the national interest. And I think it's a mistake to go looking for instances to find a religious influence, in which we find American policymakers saying, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to pursue this policy because it's consistent with my religious views, even if it's inconsistent with the American national interest. Religion never trumped the national interest. Instead, I argue, religion helped determine what the national interest was. And we forget that the national interest isn't always objective. That's why we argue over foreign policy. That's why it's such a contentious issue. If it was so obvious what the United States should do in the world, it wouldn't be the point of such contention. And what religion does is it helps frame the way in which people determine what the national interest was. In this sense, religion doesn't replace what we know, but enhances it. Religion provides missing pieces of a puzzle. We generally know what the puzzle already looks like, but we don't have the full picture. And by looking for these missing pieces, we get a better sense of what the puzzle of American foreign policy actually looks like. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, we have a wireless mic here on the stand. We'd ask you to gin up your courage and come down. We'll take questions as long as time allows. And feel free to come across the front if you'd like, and don't all come at once.
I wanted to ask about George Herbert Walker Bush. Bush Sr., which was such an important 4 years for American foreign policy, but then, of course, he wasn't reelected, and so then it's kind of like, well, what does that all mean? And also his influence on his son as well. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a big question, a great question. And in that epilogue that I mentioned, the last chapter of the book finishes with Ronald Reagan and the end of the Cold War, and I argue that religion was at the very heart of Reagan's dual approach to the Soviet Union. on the one hand, confrontation. We remember the Evil Empire speech and SDI and things like that. On the other hand, he was simultaneously reaching out to the Soviet Union and trying to come up with some sort of new relationship, a new peaceful relationship with the USSR, and religion was at the very heart of that. That's the last chapter. The epilogue that I mentioned, where I deal with George W. Bush and Barack Obama, also has, I think, two or three paragraphs on the Bush senior years, and then I think 2 or 3 paragraphs on the Bill Clinton years, so not very much at all. I have written elsewhere on Bush and religion and American foreign policy, and Bush is one of those cases where a very, by all accounts, a very religious man, also brought up in the Episcopal Church, not an evangelical, not very conservative in his faith, even though he was fairly conservative in his politics. And I couldn't really find a whole lot of influence of Bush's religion, despite nobody doubts the genuine depth of his faith, to the application of his foreign policy. We think of Bush Sr. as a realist, and the people around him, like Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft and others, as realists, and they were. That's not to say that they were immoral or amoral, but they saw the world through a realist framework. So I didn't find a lot of direct influence of Bush's religion, or Baker's, also an Episcopalian, to American foreign policy. There was a lot of religious protest in the Bush years, and he took that on board. And during the run-up to the Gulf War, during Desert Shield, there was a lot of disquiet and a lot of protest throughout the country. Of course, a lot of support as well. But it was we forget, because it was such a successful war in many ways, it was a very divisive issue. And Bush's own church, the Episcopal Church, officially came out against going to war before Desert Storm opened up I think they did in January. And even Billy Graham, who was very close to the Bush family, didn't tell Bush not to go to war, but he was quite afraid. He thought it was potentially apocalyptic in a very biblical sense, that Saddam Hussein meant what he said when this was going to be the mother of all wars, and he was going to wage this scorched earth campaign. And so a lot of people were quite wary. And the argument that I would make about Bush is that because of his contacts in the Episcopal Church and with people like Billy Graham, he framed Desert Shield, he framed the whole issue in a much more values-driven way than he would otherwise have done. That he never did vis-a-vis the Balkans or the breakup of the Soviet Union. This is where things like the New World Order speech come from, and that the United States was, Bush promised to do very un-Bush-like things, Bush Sr., that is, to bring in a new world order of peace and democracy and the promotion of human rights and humanitarianism and that sort of thing. And I argue that all of those speeches and that sort of promotion of that new world order idea, in part, not entirely, but in part came from this religious perspective. The irony being that it drove a lot of very conservative Christians like Pat Robertson nuts. That very phrase, New World Order, it drove them crazy. And then from Bush Senior to Bush Junior, I don't think there's very much of a religious influence there at all. I'm not sure. I'm not a specialist in the Bush family. We have a very good friend who is, but I myself don't see a lot of. I mean, they're close father-son pairing, but I don't see a lot of direct influence from Senior to Junior. And Bush Jr., when he was asked himself in the run-up to the Iraq War, which if he turns to his father for guidance, he said, "I turn to a higher father for guidance," meaning God. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you there, but that's how I see the two playing out.
Yeah, thanks. I had a brief question about American policy in the 1890s, specifically in the Spanish-American War. And I was interested in what you said about McKinley being underappreciated as kind of this religious figure, even though he's often quoted for famously saying that we went into the Philippines because of divine revelation to some United Methodist conference. So how then does that play out? If there's such a distance between the historiography of American religion and the historiography of American foreign relations, how has there been such an oversight in regards to the McKinley administration and into Theodore Roosevelt and so on?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and it's a huge question, and it's really two questions. One is how historians misunderstood McKinley, which I think they have, and then why have historians misunderstood religion in general? And I think they have until very recently. And those are two questions. I'll focus on McKinley because the other one is broader, and we could be here for a while. And plus, the evidence that I have for that of why historians in the past have ignored religion is just my conjecture. I mean, in a nutshell, I think it's because academic historians haven't been very comfortable with religion unless they've been in a religious studies department, or unless they have been religious historians, and then those people haven't been very interested in American foreign policy. So, but American diplomatic historians, and I think American historians of a lot of, I mean, religion was written out of the story of civil rights, of immigration, of a lot of progressivism for a long time, or it was a kind of minority faction within those historiographies. So I think historians, historians of the United States of all sorts of subfields have missed the religious influence or the religious role, if you don't like the word influence, because I don't think they're very comfortable with religion. It seems to be its own separate world, as it were. With McKinley, and I make a big deal of McKinley in the book because to me he is the epitome of this, one of the epitomes of this misunderstanding. One of the most famous passages in American diplomatic history is when McKinley justifies the taking of the Philippines, and he says he wrestled. It was an incredibly divisive issue for the long, in American politics, and he explained his decision. You're absolutely right, to a group of United Methodists in the White House who were visiting him, missionary leaders from the Methodist Church who were visiting the White House, and he said he woke up one night and he was pacing the White House and he couldn't decide whether to take the Philippines or what else to do with them, and he said it came to him. God spoke to him, and it was a divine revelation, and God said that we have to take them all, meaning all of the Philippine islands, and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. And it's an infamous passage, and diplomatic historians have had a field day with it. And any document reader, any collection of documents, that document will always be there if you're looking at the history of American foreign policy. And most historians have agreed with Akira Irie, who in 1973 wrote an article called Imperialism and Sincerity, and he said McKinley was obviously being insincere. He wasn't a particularly religious man, and instead the Philippines were important for strategic reasons, or for resources, or in the imperialistic rivalry with the European powers, and to seize it for its natural harbors and that kind of thing. And what struck me, and I always believe that too, what struck me was that no historian had really looked at least no historian of American foreign relations, had looked at McKinley's religion and his religious biography. And it turns out he's right up there with George W. Bush or Woodrow Wilson or Jimmy Carter as one of the most religious presidents in history. He was an evangelical before people would have described themselves as evangelicals, but he was an intensely devout Methodist. And religion forms this line through his entire life. He talked about growing up listening to Methodist circuit riders in antebellum Ohio, to his support for abolition at a time when the only abolitionists were coming at it from a faith-based perspective, to use a modern term, right through his rise to politics. And the type of religious politics that he was involved in was very reformist. It was very reformist. And so to me, when McKinley, this is compressing a fairly complex story in the interest of time, but to me, when McKinley says, I want to take the Philippines to uplift and civilize and Christianize them, that's the language he'd been using, sort of this Christian reformism for decades. It fit perfectly with who McKinley was. And that doesn't mean that's the only reason he was he decided to take the Philippines. Of course, all those other things, strategy, economics, imperial rivalry, they all matter. But there's more to it than that. And then if you accept my argument, then it helps explain more how the United States decided to govern the Philippines in building schools and medical clinics and all that stuff. Now, I'm not justifying the United States taking the Philippines. When I talk about McKinley, I always get in trouble for that because people say, well, you're just justifying the taking of the Philippines or putting a gloss on it. And I'm not trying to do that at all. What I'm trying to do is just help explain why people did what they did in the past. And to me, religion sort of makes more sense in that context.
I have a question about I mean, I'm thinking of an incident that I sort of stumbled across working on a project in which I don't know if it was called the State Department in the 19th century, but basically there was this this directive to consular officials and ambassadors abroad to sort of keep their eye out for Mormon missionaries that were, you know, trying to spread their dangerous belief and you know, bring lots of converts, especially women, of course, to Utah. And I'm not necessarily interested in that specific incident, but I am, you know, curious what you know, I would think predominantly Protestant sort of identity, religious identity of the United States for much of its history, how that played out in specific terms in relationship to foreign relations associated with non-Protestant religions. So, I mean, Islam is the obvious one in our context today. But what about Roman Catholicism, for example, in the 19th century? Or you mentioned FDR. What about the Holocaust and Jews, Judaism in general? How has American policy, foreign policy, been influenced in terms of attitudes towards minority religions, basically?
That's a great question. I don't have a lot on Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, three of the great world religions, and which obviously have a lot of adherents throughout the world. Because this is going to sound, if you've seen the book, this will sound odd, what I'm about to say, but I was trying to keep the book as narrow as possible and as short as possible. And one of the things that I decided to do at the outset in order to narrow it was not to look at American interaction, to look at how Americans view the world, really to look at American religion. And for a long time in American history, you can't really talk about Hinduism or Islam. I do have a bit on the Nation of Islam. And of course, after 1965, after the immigration reforms in the Great Society, Muslims start to have more of a presence. But for most of American history, there isn't really much of a presence of Muslims influencing foreign policy, certainly not from the top down and not really from the bottom up. And believe me, it would have been so great in a timely way for my book, especially getting it reviewed. I really wanted to find that Muslim influence on American foreign policy, and I looked and I couldn't find it, to say nothing of Buddhists or Hindus. In the United States, Catholics, Jews, Mormons, others have, I argue, have always had to conform until quite recently, and I think it's changed now. I'm confident it has changed now. But certainly in the 18th, 19th, and well into the 20th century, had to conform to a kind of what we might call, a mainline Protestant norm on any number of issues, on war and peace and on other sorts of things. And this was a way, and foreign policy often was a way for these groups to assimilate to this Protestant norm into the American mainstream. The classic story is Catholics who, through the Spanish-American War and World War I, two wars that they opposed privately, but very publicly supported as a way to prove their Americanness, as a way to prove that they were patriotic citizens, just as patriotic as those Protestants who were saying they were taking orders from the Vatican. That's also true through World War II, and then the Cold War comes along, and this is the great time to be a Catholic if you want to prove your patriotic bona fides, because you can't find many people in the world, or you couldn't find many people in the world who were more naturally anti-communist than Roman Catholics. So I argue in the book that this was one of the ways in which Catholics could safely enter the mainstream, was through war and diplomacy. One of my case studies, interesting you mentioned Mormon missionaries in the 19th century, because one of the case studies that I have in the book, and it's one of the case studies that I have in other versions of this talk, involves Mormon missionaries to Europe and to European colonies like French Tahiti in the 19th century, who were being persecuted simply for being Mormons, because they were proselytizing, trying to win converts, just like any other missionaries were in the 19th century. And they were being persecuted in places where Protestant missionaries wouldn't be persecuted. And so places like Britain, or sorry, not Britain. Britain was one of the exceptions, but in France and Germany and Norway, Denmark, Italy, and a couple of other countries too that are escaping me. And these Mormon missionaries did what any American abroad, any American would do if they get into trouble abroad. They would turn to their local consulate or embassy and seek consular help. And these American diplomats were not sympathetic to these Mormon missionaries. They weren't sympathetic to Protestant missionaries either, but they were even more unsympathetic to Mormon missionaries. They wanted no part of what they were doing. And so they wrote back to the State Department and said, what do we do with these missionaries? Because they're not breaking any laws that we would consider legitimate laws. They're not, beating anyone up. They're not assaulting anyone. They're not stealing anything. They're just standing on a street corner and talking to people or whatever. And the State Department, which also wasn't particularly sympathetic to their cause, investigated it. And John Hay then sent I quote it extensively in the book, sent a telegram to all U.S. embassies and consulates in the world saying protection, because all they're being abused for is they're simply being abused because of their faith. And they have a universal right to religious liberty, to basically preach their faith. And we in the United States have a duty to protect that. Now, the interesting thing is these Mormon missionaries were preaching proselytizing in countries that didn't officially recognize a universal right to religious liberty because they had established churches, or they had privileged churches, or what have you. And they saw it as a threat to national identity or to the state to win converts away from the official church, be it the Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church or whatever. But the State Department came down very firmly on the side of the missionaries, of the Mormon missionaries. And these American diplomats in Paris and Berlin and elsewhere then went to the governments of those countries and said, you have to stop harassing these missionaries. Now, all harassment didn't stop, but the official line was that it had to stop, and it did stop in a lot of places. And for me, the interesting thing is, it's because the reason it's one of my case studies is it is the quintessential example of just ordinary non-policy making Americans sort of dragging the U.S. government along in the promotion of certain ideals, in this case religious liberty, that have a universal application that actually isn't so universal because it has a very particularistic local context in these countries. And this happened with Methodist missionaries in South America, where they actually changed local law, where Protestants weren't allowed to marry or preside over death rights, to give death rights or marriage rights, to do baptisms or anything like that. And in Ecuador and Peru and a couple of other countries, they actually changed local law in order to accommodate the American idea of religious liberty in places where they didn't recognize a universal right to religious liberty. And that's one of the, and that's not a unique story. That there are so many stories of these non-policy making ordinary Americans successfully pressuring the federal government to do something in the name of a human right, a value, what have you, when the U.S. government really doesn't want to. I'll say one more thing about the Mormon missionaries. The reason I love that case is because the same thing happened with Protestant missionaries in China and Catholic missionaries in China. They would get harassed. They'd turn to the American government. They'd drag the U.S. government into China, deeper and deeper into China. But most historians, when they look at that case, say that's simply the U.S. government using missionaries as a cover for their imperialistic motives, right? To entrench their presence in China or in somewhere else in the colonial world, or what in the Cold War we called the Third World. But the Mormon missionaries were in Europe. There's no American imperial agenda for Germany or France or Norway. This is simply the promotion against U.S. government, really against their intentions, their best intentions, about the promotion of a universal right and putting that universal right at the heart of American foreign policy.
I realize this isn't a simple question, so if we need to sum it up
Last
later.
questions are never simple.
Right.
It's like the last ski run of the day. This is when you break your leg, right? So,
Right, because there's no ski runs after that. But I'll risk it.
Okay.
So, how has religion played a role in U.S. foreign policy that has an overtly religious nature to it? The only case that comes to mind is the conflict in Israel and Palestine.
Christian Zionism, support for Israel, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that dynamic, how has the ebb and flow worked in that situation?
Okay, well, I think, it's a great question, and that is certainly one of the prime examples. And I spend not a whole lot of time in my book on Christian Zionism since 1967, since the Six-Day War, because there's a huge literature on that, and it's actually a pretty good literature. Sometimes I found where, okay, scholars have misunderstood religion in a certain way, but sometimes I found actually that historians had more or less got it right. And I think they've more or less got it right with Christian Zionism. So I didn't have much to say, so I think I've got a couple of paragraphs on it instead of quite a bit. But one of the points of the book, and if you read it, or if you have read it, well, if you have read it, then okay, good, because then I'd be in trouble. Because I was going to say, if you read my book, hopefully you'll see that there are other cases that have a more overtly religious nature to them, be it with Franklin Roosevelt, be it Truman and the recognition of Israel, be it Mormon missionaries or other missionaries promoting universal human rights, which to me I see as the dawn of the American century. And at the heart of the American century is what we might call informal empire or regulatory empire, where it's the promotion of ideas and the enforcement of ideas, sometimes with force, but most often not with force. So I would say I hope with what my book will do, if it does anything, is to show that there are other episodes that we should think of as also religious. And I think Christian Zionism gets such play because it's just such great fodder for journalists. And journalists have done great work on Christian Zionism, right? It ticks a lot of the boxes. It ticks the Middle East, Israel, the Palestinians. It ticks the religious right box, the fundamentalist box. You get all sorts of really colorful language. And journalists writing for mainstream publications, that makes great copy. And historians have picked up on that. And I think that's one of the reasons why that's an example that everybody knows about. But I would say that there are lots of other examples there too, that we just have to dig a bit deeper and then also take religion a bit more seriously. And understand it on its own terms a bit better to see those episodes. I hope I didn't break my leg there.